UK, an advice charity and service, and Eleanor Solomon, who's a specialist housing lawyer at Anthony Gold Solicitors. Daniel is going to speak about rent arrears and what benefits you might be entitled to and how you can get support. And then Eleanor is going to speak about the eviction process. And there'll be an opportunity at the end for you all to ask questions. And we've had a few people submit questions in advance, so I'll be asking Daniel and Eleanor for their advice on those issues as well. So yeah. Without much more fanfare, I'm going to pass over to Daniel now, who's prepared some slides on rent arrears in the welfare system.
Sorry, just bear with me 2 seconds. I'm just going to try and show you. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Hallstrom. As Kevin said, I'm a housing caseworker at Z2K. We're a charity that works with people in poverty who are eligible for or receiving a means tested benefit and who live in a London or Greater London borough. So my work predominantly consists of housing related benefits casework, homelessness and social housing casework, as well as casework aimed at people in the private rented sector. And in the main, the charity focuses on benefits casework and campaigning around benefits, with a particular focus on disability benefits. So I'd like to talk to you today about 3 topics I've been asked to address. So as you might already be aware, the rules surrounding benefits are often quite complex and opaque, and I'll try to be as brief and non-specialist as I possibly can. I'll talk firstly about how much help you can get with housing costs under UC, Universal Credit rather, UC for short, and some things you might want to be aware of in assessing your potential entitlement. I'll have left out some important things, but we can hopefully touch on those in our subsequent discussion. Then I'll go on to talk about support that you can obtain when benefit levels prove to be insufficient, when they don't cover the entirety of your rent. I'll mostly focus on discretionary housing payments, which are dispersed by local authorities to plug gaps in housing cost provision. Finally, I'll talk briefly about how you might want to approach rent arrears worries with your landlord from a benefits perspective. So how you can explain the help available under the benefit system to a landlord when you're facing rent arrears. So under UC, you can receive help with housing costs in addition to the standard allowance and any other elements that you qualified for, such as the child element or the carer element. I'll principally discuss UC. Since January 2021, very, very few categories of people are entitled to make new claims for housing benefit. In practice, only those people who live in temporary accommodation. So the benefit cap limits your overall benefit entitlement to a prescribed maximum amount, depending on your circumstances and where you live. Now, I won't go into too much depth about the benefit cap, other than to say that it's always worth checking to see if you'll be affected or whether you might qualify for an exemption. I'll set out those categories of exemption later. Now, if the housing cost element is included in your universal credit claim, it will also affect basically how your earnings are calculated under it. So you will probably qualify for a lower work allowance so that more of your earnings are taken into account and are subject to reduction under the earnings taper. And that can also affect the overall amount that you can get under UC. It's always worth checking to see whether you're entitled to universal credit. You might have seen figures that suggest something like £15 billion of benefits go unclaimed in the UK every year. And obviously since the COVID-19 pandemic, millions have been relying on the social safety security net and realising particularly quite how many holes there are in our social security provision. So UC housing costs are generally paid together with the rest of your standard allowance. So that's the fixed amount of money that you'll get under UC. And the maximum amount you'll get towards your housing costs is determined under a formula that's known as the local housing allowance. That's the 30th percentile of median private rents in your local area. And the rate that applies in your case will depend on the number of bedrooms that you're entitled to. Now, this doesn't necessarily correspond to the number of bedrooms in your house, but it's determined under the Universal Credit Regulations. And for most single people under 35, this will be the shared accommodation rate, even if you don't live in shared accommodation. Now, this figure is quite substantially lower than which is available under the one bedroom self-contained rate. So the amount that you receive in housing costs will also be affected by whether or not you have any non-dependents living with you. So these are people who live with you other than those who depend on you, such as, for example, grown-up children or relatives, and who the DWP can reasonably contribute towards your housing costs, even if they don't actually do so. This doesn't, importantly, include joint tenants in shared accommodation. So to calculate your bedroom entitlement under the local housing allowance, the DWP doesn't, as I said, look at the number of bedrooms actually in your house, but instead your entitlement under the regulations. So you'll get an allowance of one bedroom for each of the following categories. So one for you and your partner, if you live with one, and one for a young person under 20, one for a non-dependent age at least 16, and so on. You will be able to get an additional amount if you have, for example, a non-resident carer, or are a member of a couple who can't share a bedroom for some reason, or you have a disabled child that can't share a bedroom. It's also worth noting that even if you are entitled to more than 4 bedrooms under these rules, this only goes up to a maximum of 4 bedrooms. So even if you have more than 4 bedrooms in your house, you'll only get up to 4 bedrooms worth of housing costs. So, as I said previously, most single people under 35 who don't live with their partner or who don't have dependent or non-dependent family members who live with them will be entitled to the 1 bedroom shared accommodation rate. So, and I do apologise for being quite so London-centric. So these are the local housing allowance rates for inner London boroughs by area. So the way that this works in practice is, I'll take someone like me, I'm under 35, I live in inner East London, I live in shared housing, and I'm eligible for the shared housing rate. So I can get £136.50 times 4 a month in housing costs. So about £546, which falls short of my contractual rent by about £60. Were I over 35 and living in the same house, I get the 1 bedroom rate, so £295.49 a week, £1,181.96 a month, so comfortably enough to cover the contractual rent I owe. A household that was entitled to 4 bedrooms under the bedroom entitlement could get £2,342.80. So, and obviously this, you may have heard talk of the bedroom tax as well. That only applies to social rent, so social housing, and it won't affect you in the private rented sector. A very quick and easy way of doing this is a very useful online tool, which is on the DirectGov page, which is the local housing allowance rate calculator, and that allows you to see both the local housing allowance rate that applies in your area and also the bedrooms that you're entitled for under the calculation, rather than sort of working out under the regulations. Finally, and importantly, people who normally live with you other than your partner and your children, non-dependents in other words, will basically give rise to a fixed deduction, a flat rate deduction of £75.15 per month for each of those non-dependents in your household unless they're exempt for some reason. So receiving a disability benefit, under 21, or childcare responsibilities, for example. So where benefit levels are insufficient, so there is a very helpful and flexible pot of money, but a finite pot of money that local authorities can distribute to meet in benefit provision according to their discretion. It's called the discretionary housing payment. Now, this can cover shortfalls caused, for example, by the benefit cap or by the local housing allowance or non-dependent deductions indeed, but it can also be used to cover rent arrears or even other housing costs like rent in advance or deposits or even reasonable moving expenses. Most authorities will have online policies that govern how they distribute DHPs, but they should be flexible and not over-prescriptive about how they administer them. Now, in theory, DHP should be flexible enough to provide support, even if your rent is being paid in full and directly to your landlord. However, there is a very important catch, and that is that you can't get help for any period in which you weren't entitled to universal credit or housing benefit, as the case may be, that included a housing element. So as far as how to make an application for one is concerned, you can generally go through a local authority website, they'll provide a form, and you will need to provide fairly in-depth evidence about your financial circumstances. Local authorities will invariably look to make an award of DHP on a short-term basis. They'll want to see that there is some sort of change of circumstances, which means that, or future prospective change of circumstances, which means that they don't have to pay out for an indefinite period. So, for example, you might be able to tell a local authority that you expect to get a job in X number of months, or that you're applying and hope to obtain a disability benefit, such that they only need to award that discretionary housing payment for a fixed and finite period. But there isn't actually an upper limit on the length of time that they can award a DHP. And indeed, there is quite a wide discretion for how the money can be used. Generally speaking, there is a right of review to a local authority on a decision about a discretionary housing payment, but you won't be able to appeal to a tribunal. You should contact a benefits advisor if you're turned down for a DHP and you need to challenge it further. That's something that can be done through judicial review, essentially. So, just thought I'd show you how this sort of works in practice. Now, obviously, we've talked about how local housing allowance rates can squeeze the amount that you can get under housing costs. But almost equally significant in terms of its practical effect is the benefit cap. Now, this, as I touched on earlier, basically affects the maximum amount of benefit that you can receive. And it can, in some cases, severely impact the money that's available for you to live on. I'll give the example of a person, Nina. Now, she loses out because of the benefit cap and the local housing allowance. I've put the figures on screen. So she is entitled to the one-bedroom LHA rate for in Northwest London of £1,181.96 a month, and that's how much universal credit paid towards her rent. It doesn't meet all of that rent, which is £1,300 a month. But then an additional problem is that the benefit cap limits her overall entitlement to benefits to £1,185.40 a month. And because all of her rent is paid directly to the landlord, she's left with £3.44 a month of universal credit to live on. Now, Nina suffers from a neurological pain condition and depression, such that the first thing that she should do, in theory at least, is after applying for a discretionary housing payment, would be to explore her entitlement to personal independence payment or a benefit of that kind. If she can establish an entitlement to personal independence payment, the benefit cap will lift, and she'll be able to receive her standard allowance on top of the £1,180.96 she gets for her rent under the local housing allowance. So, I mean, quite a drastic difference there in the amount that's available for her to live on. Now, there are broad categories of exemptions from the benefit cap. It's always worth, I'll just draw your attention to two of them. Firstly, I would always advise someone who has health conditions that cause them difficulties day to day to look at applying for personal independence payment. It's payable irrespective of whether or not you're in employment, and it provides additional money to meet living expenses, as well as potentially lifting the benefit cap and increasing the amount of money that you can get in terms of housing costs. And I've enclosed some resources at the end of the presentation which can help you look at whether or not you might be entitled to this. Another thing to be wary of, and I know that a lot of people have been caught out by this, certainly since the start of the pandemic, is the grace period. So the period of 9 months for which the benefit cap is disapplied to people who've been in employment for the last 12 months. Now that can cause a quite drastic fall off in the amount that you can get under universal credit once those 9 months have elapsed. So from the point of applying. So that, yeah, I mean, as I say, I'd always advise looking at whether or not you'll be affected by the benefit cap, or whether or not you can establish an exemption to the benefit cap. And, you know, there is certainly scope for that, and that can sort of help with affordability issues. So in terms of the practical side of how to approach rent arrears worries with the landlord, and the last thing I'll touch on is the possibility of setting up alternative payment arrangements with a landlord. Now, Department for Work and Pensions guidance says that the landlord can request housing costs to be paid to them directly once you fall more than 2 months into rent arrears, but you can also ask for this voluntarily. UC will then consider whether you fall into a category of people who are deemed to potentially benefit from such alternative payment arrangements. And that basically potentially provides for some additional flexibility in the way that universal credit is paid, such that, for example, housing costs can be paid directly to your landlord, or more frequently than once monthly, whatever might be helpful in that particular situation. There's also the possibility of the landlord seeking recovery of some of those rent arrears directly from your universal credit standard allowance. This will generally be at a rate between 10 and 20% of the standard allowance, but there is a discretion to charge less. And in fact, there might be a strong argument that they should do so if that would cause undue financial hardship. And if you do suffer financial hardship as a result of a third-party deduction, it's always, again, worth speaking to a benefits advisor who can potentially help challenge the rate of deductions and ensure that universal credit exercise that discretion properly. So, to sum up, I think some points that are worth mentioning as far as how you should broach and discuss benefits entitlements with a landlord who might be wary or otherwise of getting housing costs covered through universal credit. Now, a very clear upside to the benefit system is that it provides consistent, steady income, and that might serve to reassure a landlord, you know, that an amount of rent will be covered every month. The fact that alternative payment arrangements or third-party deductions can be used to request payments of rent arrears directly from universal credit without the need to take enforcement action is also an upside, and that might make a landlord less inclined to pursue possession proceedings. And as we've touched on in some detail, where universal credit won't cover your contractual rent, there are other forms of help, such as discretionary housing payments that might be available to cover the difference. Alternatively, it might be possible to maximise your benefit entitlement, covers more of your housing costs. But I'd say, as a general rule of thumb, the benefit system is complex. It's definitely not a panacea, and it's always worth trying other methods, such as negotiating rent reductions, devising a feasible repayment plan, seeking budgeting advice from a debt advisor, and so on. But hopefully this talk will equip you with some more tools and some more confidence about the sort of help that you can get through universal credit for your housing costs. I've just put some resources up on screen, some really useful ones. So Entitled to do a really good benefits calculator, which is just quite a useful tool. You can check how much you are entitled to online. There's a similar tool on the Turn to Us website. As far as disability benefits are concerned, you might want to look at pipinfo.net and wcainfo.net. They're very, very useful tools. They're a bit specialist, but they, I think, capture some of the nuance of how disability benefits can apply, and certainly can give you a lot more detail about the sorts of things that will qualify. More generally, Shelter obviously run excellent resources, and so we talked about discretionary housing payments. It's always worth checking to see if your local authorities published a DHP policy on their website, which sets out how they prioritise and consider applications for that. So yeah, without further ado, that's my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. That was an incredibly useful and clear explanation of what is an incredibly complex system, and it's some really useful. Someone's in the chat called it brilliant, which I fully agree with. There's some really useful resources that you put in there and useful links that we will be sharing with all attendees. I think it was really, really helpful to hear the practical ways that you can discuss and frame benefits with landlords, and mention that they're very, very steady sources of income. So thank you for that. We're going to move on now, before we do questions, to Eleanor, who's going to talk a bit about the in and outs of the eviction process and what you can do and where you can get help.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm not going to be using slides, so I'm just going to talk to you today. And I just want to talk through the kind of process of evictions. I can't possibly go through all the potential defences and ways that an eviction can happen in this brief talk, but I think something that's often really, really confusing for people is what does happen, when can I be asked to leave, and how long can the whole thing take? So the very, very first stage is that your landlord must send you a notice. And that can be a Section 21 notice, which is a kind of no-fault notice if you have an assured short-hold tenancy. And because everything has changed, usually because of COVID, that might be for 6, 4 or 2 months, depending on when it was served. It could be a notice to quit if you're a licensee, which would usually be for 4 weeks. And it could be a notice seeking possession if you're an assured short-hold tenant or assured or secure tenant, which again will be for 6, 4 or 2 months, depending on what it's for and when it was served. So it's got even more confusing recently than it was previously. But what's really, really important is they must give you this kind of notice, and the notice must be in a specific form. So for the Section 21 notice or notice seeking possession, there is literally a form with exact wording on, and it must be that exact form, otherwise it's not valid. And for the notice to quit, there's specific prescribed wording that must be in there. So the first step is, if you receive such a notice, look at it. It will tell you on there when you have to leave by, and check that they've got the dates right. You'll have to refer to getting some legal advice, or in the first instance, going to a website such as Shelters to kind of work this out. It will tell you, you must leave by this date. The first thing to realise is you do not have to leave by that date. You can do, of course, and if your tenancy is otherwise in a fixed term or something, when you wouldn't be able to leave, it means that you can leave by that date with no repercussions. The tenancy will be over, but you don't have to. That's definitely not the end of the process. And if your landlord attempts to evict you at this stage or at the end of that process, then that will be a legal eviction, which would be a criminal offence, and you'll be able to seek damages and, in theory, call the police and ask for their assistance, although they're not always the most helpful in that situation. But the notice is step one. It's not the end of the process. If it gets to the end of the notice period and you haven't left, then your landlord then has to go to step 2, which is sending papers to court. So they'll send a particulars of claim and claim form to court, setting out to the court why the court should give a possession order, so make an order asking you to leave. And for the Section 21, this might be just that it's a tick box exercise about automatic entitlement. If it's rent arrears, they'll have to prove that you haven't paid your rent. It's a fairly simple form, and the court will send you a copy of that form that the landlord sent to court, and they will also send you a date for a review hearing. So, and it says at that stage you have to put in a defence, and it will say the date you have to put in a defence by, and there'll be a standard form for you to fill in for the defence. Now, that standard form you receive won't necessarily bear any actual reality on what you have to fill in, because it's only relevant for rent arrears. So if you have some kind of other complex possession claim, like that your landlord's trying to claim antisocial behaviour, or that you're not the tenant or entitled to be there, then the form won't make any sense, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you fill it in. Instead, you should seek legal advice. If it is a rent arrears issue, then you should fill in the form that the court will send you, which basically says how much money you have and whether you can afford to pay any rent. Another really important thing to note is it gives you a deadline to fill in that defence, but that's, again, not a real deadline. You can put in a defence at any point up until a possession order is made, essentially. So, or unless the court orders otherwise and debars you after a certain date. So do put it in if it's late. The only disbenefit to you to doing it late will be potentially legal costs, consequences, but if you're unrepresented, that makes zero difference to you, really, in terms of recovering your own legal costs, which you won't have. So do put that defence in. Don't think I'm too late, I can't do it anymore. You still can do it. Then the next stage is a review appointment, and you'll get a letter saying it's a review hearing, a letter from the court. It's not actually a court hearing. It just has to be called that to enable you to be able to get legal aid. What it is a day set aside for you to talk to your landlord and for you to get legal advice from a duty solicitor by calling them. So there'll be a number on the form, and it will say contact the duty solicitor. And in advance of that hearing, you should be sent your landlord's full bundle of papers. So you should definitely contact the duty solicitor if you don't have any other legal representation, and the duty solicitor will talk to your landlord or their solicitor on the day of the review hearing. Now, if you manage to come to an agreement with your landlord on that date, which might be an agreement that you could ask that you will leave, but you want a certain sum of money for them for a new deposit, for example, that might be something the landlord will go for. It might be that actually you have a really strong defence or a counterclaim, and you want to agree directions to put that in, and then you'll find a legal advisor. In some way or another, you may be able to come to an agreement on that day. And if you do, an order will be made, and that will be the end of it. But you don't have to. You can go on, and if a date isn't set, the court will go on to list a first possession hearing. So in that review appointment, you won't physically go to court, you'll just be on the telephone. But at the first possession hearing, you should have a real hearing appointment where you really go to court. That has sometimes changed when COVID rates have been particularly bad, but that's generally the case. And at the first possession hearing, you should definitely go. Even if you think you have no defence, you should still go, because at the very least you want to know what happens. And you should again ask to see the duty advisor. And again, the duty advisor will have an opportunity to advise you, put your case for you, represent you in court. And it may be that you have a defence, in which case the judge will make directions, i.e. they will say, by this date you have to put in a witness statement, by this date you have to put in a defence, by this date you have to get an expert report to comment on this. Alternatively, you may have no defence, and it may be that a possession order is made on that date. And again, you'll have a date that you're given saying you have to leave by this date. And once again, if you don't leave by that date, you shouldn't be evicted. And if somebody turns up at that stage, it's probably still an illegal eviction. What has to happen next is, if you don't leave by that date, then your landlord has to apply to court for a warrant. And then the court will send bailiffs. There'll be a date. And at that stage, you really do have to leave. And I strongly recommend, if you find yourself in that situation, that you leave before the date of the warrant, just because otherwise it's going to be really unpleasant for you, even if it's only one day before, just to avoid the actual process of being evicted, which is usually at 8 o'clock in the morning. Even at that stage, if the warrant's been made and you have an eviction date, you can still apply to court to stay the eviction if, for example, you think you have a defence at this stage, if you couldn't go to the court hearing for a good reason, if you have suddenly come into some money and it's a rent arrears case and you think you can pay it off, you can still apply, and the court should give you an urgent hearing, and that eviction could be stayed, so it's put on hold, or it could be set aside, so it doesn't happen. There'll still be a possession order in place, and your landlord could still apply for a warrant at a later stage, but it's not the end of it at that stage. So the point of explaining this is partly that you know where you are in the process, because I often hear from people saying I had to leave at this date, and that's not necessarily true. And the other thing to say is, even if you have no defence, which you may well not do, especially if it's a Section 21 claim, you do have time. This whole process takes a very long time. Currently, your Section 21 notice might be for 6 or 4 months, depending on when it was served. And even after that, even if the landlord is very on the ball and applies to court on the very first day they can, the court will probably take months to list a review appointment, and then months again to list a first possession hearing. And then, because there's been an eviction ban until recently and there's a big backlog for the bailiffs, probably months and months and months to get to date for a warrant. So it is worth, if you don't have somewhere, if you can find somewhere to go to and you have no defence, then you may as well make arrangements as soon as you can. But it's worth, if you don't have somewhere good to go to, it's worth taking time to find somewhere and having that in mind. A caveat on that is that if you do put in a defence and you go beyond the first possession hearing, then you could be liable for your landlord's legal costs, which would be more than the fixed costs. So there'll be fixed costs of a few £100s to be paid if a possession order is made at all, which would be added to any debt that you owe. If you go through the whole process of defending the claim and you don't have legal aid, then you could have a hefty cost bill on top of whatever you owe. So that's worth bearing in mind. But even getting to the first possession hearing is relatively far down the line. If you leave before anything's issued at court, then you won't have to pay any legal costs at all. Again, another caveat being, check your tenancy agreement, because sometimes there's a contractual basis in the tenancy agreement for paying the landlord's legal costs if you come into arrears or don't leave. But you may find yourself in a position, if you have large arrears, and where that's slightly academic anyway, because you're going to be owing a large sum of money regardless, and having somewhere, a roof over your head for a while longer is your top priority. So that's the kind of overview of the process, and defending the whole thing could take, I don't know, 6 months to a year. If you find that you do have a defence, especially to a Section 21 notice, don't tell your landlord before they've started a claim at court, because then they can just remedy it and then they'll get you out in the end. Any kind of defence is just a time buying mechanism. So if you have a defence to a Section 21 claim, wait for them to issue the proceedings, and then you put in the defence, and then you've bought yourself more time. If you have another kind of defence, like, for example, your landlord's saying that you owe them money, but you don't think you do for some reason because of a dispute about the sum of the rent, or you think you have a counterclaim because there's terrible disrepair and the money that your landlord owes you outweighs the money you owe them, then it is worth raising that before it gets to court and trying to resolve the dispute before it started at court to minimise the risk to you. But if the defence is something to do with the notice and the way it's served, then the best bet is to keep quiet, because all that's going to happen is your landlord's going to serve the right one, and the amount of time you've bought yourself will be minimised. I think there's quite a few questions, so should we move on to the questions and we'll deal with other issues in there?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Thank you very much for that overview, Eleanor. It's so important that everyone actually knows the details of the system so that we can make the right decision based on that. There are quite a few questions in the chat, and there's a few that were submitted beforehand, so we'll try and get through as many as possible, and I'll try and group ones that might be on similar themes. So I'm going to start with the ones that were emailed in advance. And the first one says, I received a Section 21 notice last Friday. I don't have any rent arrears, and I think they want the property back to charge much higher rent. However, it also looks like a retaliation for complaints I made about some issues, including repairs not being done. There is an open case with the property ombudsman, and I also reported them to the council for the repairs not being done. Can this invalidate the Section 21 notice? I guess I'll ask Eleanor first and then Daniel.
Okay, thank you. So the issue is basically whether the complaints about repairs to the council will invalidate the notice, and that there are situations where that could happen. A complaint to the council about the condition of the property would only invalidate the notice if the complaint was made before the Section 21 was served, and the council serves an improvement notice or an emergency remediation notice before the possession order is made. So there's still time for the council to do that, even if they haven't done it now, as long as it's before the possession order, as opposed to the Section 21 notice. Unfortunately, if you have done the repair works yourself in the end, and therefore there is no longer a state of disrepair where an improvement notice would be necessary, the council is unlikely to serve such a notice if they haven't done already, because an improvement won't be needed, and therefore it's highly unlikely to invalidate the Section 21 notice in this case. But there are a myriad of technical defences available to Section 21, so it is worth looking through all the other ones about the notice of time that has been given, deposit protection, how to rent guide, etc. So don't give up yet, but I don't think the repairs are going to be the answer.
Thank you. Daniel, is there anything you'd add to that, or if not, I can move on to the next one?
I'd echo that. I mean, it's one of those things where, unfortunately, it's a very, very narrow event, particularly the one that comes out of the deregulation. It was a deregulation act in 2015, and yeah, it really does depend on service of those notices, unfortunately.
That makes sense. So there's a question in the chat from someone who has a question about Section 21s relating to COVID. Norbert says, I had a Section 21 served on me about 18 months ago, but the landlord never went ahead with the repossession, and then COVID came along, so I'm still at the same address. Will the landlord have to serve a new Section 21, or can he now go straight to court?
I believe the landlord will have to serve a new Section 21, because that will now have expired if it's 18 months old. So yeah, they will, and they'll have to give you a longer notice period, and before they can go to court. Notice out of date.
That's good. How long before Section 21 has become invalid?
It has to be served within 6 months. So it's invalid by quite a long way. So they'll have to start again, and they'll have to give you 4 months notice this time. So that's good.
That is good. Well, good news in the context of being served a Section 21, which is never good news. So there's someone has anonymously put in the chat, my landlord told the tenants, which was us, in December 2020 to leave by the end of March 2021 as he was selling. He served no notice at all, and now he's reletting and renting the flat out again. Just 2 months, June 2021 later. I believe this was an illegal eviction. Am I correct? And I suppose I would add to the attendees' question, is there anything that you can advise in cases of illegal eviction? Daniel and Eleanor.
I mean, I guess the question here that I don't fully understand is whether you've left and whether you were made to leave, because if you haven't left, then there's been no eviction yet. For an illegal eviction to happen, you have to have not willingly left. If somebody asks you to leave without threatening you and you just leave, then that's not an illegal eviction, even if you feel coerced and you were the information was misrepresented. But if you are sort of physically chucked out or the lock's changed, then it's definitely an illegal eviction.
I'd add to that as well, that in terms of seeking homelessness assistance from a local authority, that kind of leaving prematurely is liable problems, and it really is just worth standing on those limited rights you have to remain in occupation for as long as possible, and certainly not before a possession order is made.
Absolutely, and I meant to say that actually and missed it. It's really worth approaching the council if you will need homelessness assistance from the date that you receive the Section 21 notice, because they should start opening a case and assisting you from that date. They may not do, but it is worth approaching them and trying to get them on the case from that date.
That's really helpful advice about contacting the council as soon as you receive a notice and not leaving before you have to. Thanks for answering that one. There's a few others in the chat. So Sarah's asked about rent arrears and this new breathing space policy, which is that the government has introduced a breathing space policy designed to help people in debt. Is there, are rent arrears included in that, and how does it work? Because I know it's new, but hopefully, you'll be able to provide some advice.
Can you start, Dan? Have you got something to say?
I mean, you're going to need help from a regulated kind of money advisor anyway to do it, and I think those debt advisor, they're the best people to approach. But as I understand it, rent arrears are covered, and it's basically 60-day relief from creditors for a number of qualifying debts. I don't know the ins and outs of it because it's not really something I work on, but it's definitely worth talking to a debt advisor about if you think that would be useful. There's also a mental health crisis moratorium. Is it a moratorium? It's a similar scheme, but for mental health crises. Also worth looking at.
I'm afraid I don't have much to add on that.
No, that sounds good. So we'd advise seek some specialist debt advice. There's one that's just come in that says, if I'm illegally evicted, will the council help me find a home?
Okay, so the council, some councils have a support in place that are under the tenancy management officers or tenancy relation officers, where they would help you make an application for re-entry to your home, so an application against your landlord, or that's something that you could do with the help of a legal aid solicitor. In terms of homelessness assistance, the manner of your eviction won't necessarily guarantee that the council will help you find a new home. If you're illegally evicted and you are homeless, then that will meet one of the criteria, but there are also other criteria you have to meet, i.e. you have to be eligible from an immigration perspective, you have to be in priority need, which means that you have to be a child or particularly old, pregnant, have a health condition, something like that, have children yourself, which means that you are vulnerable and in priority need, and you have to not have made yourself intentionally homeless, which if you're illegally evicted shouldn't be found. I can't really imagine it could be. But in short, do approach the council, but there's no guarantee and you have to meet all the criteria.
And this is actually not a question from the chat, but I feel like there's been a few mentions of illegal eviction, and I think it's sometimes something that's relatively unknown. So would it be possible for both of you to just outline what makes an eviction illegal, and also what someone who is at risk of experiencing one or is already has experienced one could do in that situation? I think that might be quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Protection from Eviction Act says that the landlord, apart from, let's start with when it's not an illegal eviction. If you live with your landlord, then you're exempt and it's not an illegal eviction. If you're in, let me think, I mean, in most cases, your landlord has to serve a notice on you, as I just went through. So a notice to quit, a notice seeking possession, or a Section 21 notice, and they have to obtain a possession order, and then they have to get the court bailiffs. They have to follow that whole process that I've just gone through. If they evict you without doing that process, either by physically coming in and changing the locks when you're out, or harassing you, so you're forced to leave. So for example, they turn off your utilities, they physically threaten you, they tell you, if you don't leave, I'm going to cause you some violence or harm or something like that, then that's an illegal eviction, and it's a criminal offence as well as a civil wrong that you can receive compensation for and an injunction to be let back in. As it is a criminal offence, but in my experience, the police are really, really bad at recognising it as a criminal offence. And I've called the police many times when somebody's been illegally evicted and they've 100% of the time refused to help. But it's still, despite that, do call the police if something's happening. Do just phone the non-emergency line if it's a kind of not emergency happening right now, and report the harassment. And that will help at least with a civil claim at a later date. And do tell the landlord you're doing it, and do seek legal advice urgently. Got anything to add, Dan?
Yeah, two things. I mean, firstly, and then talked about council tenancy relation officers. I mean, very like invariably, yeah, a useful sort of place to contact. But I was going to say that rent repayment orders. So I think I'm right in saying that they also cover illegal evictions, don't they? But they will also cover harassment, actually take a landlord to a property tribunal and get rent back for a period over which you've been harassed, or a period in which you've been in an unlicensed HMO, and so on. I mean, that's some other way of kind of getting some other form of compensation. But yeah, I mean, I just reiterate everything there. So
yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult, because to get a rent repayment order for an illegal eviction, you have to prove to the criminal burden of proof that you've been illegally evicted, so beyond reasonable doubt. But to get those civil damages in the county courts, you only have to prove it on the balance of probabilities, so 51%, and you can get legal aid if you're eligible financially. So I'd say if you are eligible for legal aid, it's worth trying to get a legal aid lawyer and doing it the civil way. If there's a conviction from the police, then it's definitely worth getting a rent repayment order, because that's already the work done. That should be a sort of tick box exercise, but otherwise it might be tricky to do it regarding the rent repayment order route.
That's really helpful, thank you. I guess this is probably linked, but there's one in the there's a final question in the chat that's about, will I get legal support if I have to go to court? And I know before, Eleanor, you touched on the liability for people for paying legal costs if you can't get legal aid. So yeah, is there any info you can give on how you can get support?
Yeah, so absolutely everybody is eligible to see the duty advisor free of charge at the first sort of kind of hearing, the review hearing, and at any subsequent possession hearing, and likewise if you make an application to stay a warrant. So there's no financial criteria for that. You just absolutely need to contact them with there'll be a telephone number on the court form for the review date, and anyone can do that. If you are eligible financially, which is far too complex to go into now, but there is a calculator online that we can send around afterwards, then you will be able to get legal aid. So legal aid as a subject is covered under possession claims as a subject is covered, but you do have to be on quite a low income, most usually, to be financially eligible for legal aid. But it's definitely worth looking into and trying. And you also have to have a defence to get legal aid. You have to have good prospects of success. Otherwise, it's not available.
Daniel, is there anything you'd be keen to add to that? Or
one thing that is quite useful is the civil legal advice portal. We'll do like an eligibility check, and then you get put through to someone who can give you some quick advice and maybe explain some steps that you can take. It's quite a good way of getting help. And yeah, we'll also sort of serve that function of determining whether or not you're eligible for legal aid, on top of all of the other criteria that Eleanor talked about.
Shelter also have an advice line for everybody, regardless of whether you're eligible for legal aid, who can give you some telephone advice, and that's excellent. Yeah,
there are so many places you can go to get legal advice, and we'll link them all in the email that we're sending around after this session. So we've got about 8 minutes left, and I do just want to sum up at the end. And I'm aware we've been firing questions at you both kind of for a long period now. So I'm just going to take maybe one more. But there is a question about what to do if you're waiting for benefits to come through. And if you're worried about getting behind on your rent that way.
I mean, I'd never generally advise people to get advances or budgeting advances, because they do then just get taken off what you get in universal credit. It's quite a difficult question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer really, other than that. But yeah, I think it's obviously an inbuilt feature of the system that you have to wait the 5 weeks, that first payment. It really should be available much quicker, as indeed it was under legacy benefit.
Yeah, I guess all I'd say is tell your landlord, tell them you've applied, show them the evidence, reassure them that money will be coming, just to try and halt them starting any kind of possession proceedings.
That's really useful advice. Thanks both. I think that as I can see it, we've answered most of the questions that people have put in the chat. I think we've got one more that someone submitted before this, which is slightly less practical, but I think a really good question underpinning this is that someone wrote in before, why is private rent so much higher than social rent? Probably very naive of me, but why can't rents be set at an affordable level in the first place? With the cost of renting, it doesn't take a lot for people to fall into arrears, and I think, I know that that's slightly less practical, but it's something that's definitely been made very clear this year because of COVID. I mean, is there any kind of thoughts either of you have on that to close things off before I round up?
Well, I mean, social landlords have obligations that they can't make a profit. So there's no profit going in. Private landlords are making a profit. There's no rent control, so they can charge essentially whatever they want. Obviously, you can take if you have an assured short hold tenancy, you can challenge the rent if it's far higher than market rent. But if everybody's charging a market rent, that market rent can just keep going up and up and up. And also, social landlords' overheads are far lower usually than private landlords, because usually private landlords are paying a mortgage and they don't have access to the kind of, social landlords will have tens of thousands of properties, and therefore it will be relatively cheap for them to do things like repairs, because they'll have huge contracts for things to be done quite cheaply. And they're paying their mortgage, and they're paying for that, and they're in it for a very large profit. So that's why it costs so much, and there's no legislation stopping that.
I think, yeah, I can't add much to that other than to say that once upon a time it was the case that there were rent controls for about 40 years, and your fair rent was set by a rent officer and the valuation office agency. That was so that was for tenancies that started prior to 1989 or before the Housing Act 88 came into force. But yeah, we see no such luck after 89. But yeah, it'd be nice to go back to that.
That's right, and there are still with rent controls that still have tenancies predating that and still can go to the valuation office agency and get their rent assessed as a low fair rent, but yeah, sadly not for everybody else.
Yeah, it's a really good point that there are still some rent controlled tenancies, and it wasn't always this way. And it's, yeah, I mean, we at Generation Rent have lots of further reading you can look at about why housing is so unaffordable and what might be a solution. But until that change happens, like Daniel and Eleanor, you've been incredibly helpful. I found it really useful. I think the points about where you can, like, checking that you're eligible, speaking to your landlord, and making sure that you know the process inside and out for if you are faced with an eviction is incredibly helpful. I'm aware that the things covered today were fairly complex. You guys did a very clear summary of what's a very convoluted system. So we will be sending round fact sheets and advice sheets and links to the pages that Daniel and Eleanor mentioned today, for anyone that needs further advice or wants to double check something. So yes, I just want to say thank you to everyone who came along, and there are ways that you can, if you found this useful, there are ways that you can stay involved with Generation Rent. Please do keep in touch with us. You can sign up on your sorry, I've just, yeah, Antic Generation Rent have put the 5 ways that you can stay involved. So you can sign up at generationrent.org, sign up and keep up to date with all of our campaigns. You can tell us about your experience, if you've experienced a Section 21 or are in arrears of any kind. You can go onto our website and vent your rent, because your experiences of the housing system is one of the main ways that we campaign for change. You can join our renters panel, which is where we test out new ideas amongst renters and help make better policy as a result. You can help us campaign online by becoming a volunteer. And finally, you can donate. And I think, given the content of this session, I'm aware that many people, might not be in a position to do that right now. But if you can, it's always welcome. And if you can't, then there are many other ways that you can get involved. So yeah, I think all I'll do is thank our panelists again. Thank you so much for giving your time and your expertise. And if anyone needs further support, we'll make that available in a follow-up. But other than that, yeah, thank you very much. And I hope that everyone has a really nice evening.
Thank you.